Our keynote presenter today is the founder of Callback Women, an initiative that aims to reduce the well-documented gender disparity in speaker lineups at programming conferences. She is a developer, community manager, advocate, certified sex educator, and whimsical gluten-free baker. She has been an organiser and instructor for many tech women's organisations and has given talks at more than 20 technical conferences among the Python, Ruby, JavaScript and PHP communities. Please welcome Carina Zona.
All right, good morning. Thank you so much for that. You mentioned Callback Women, so I'm immediately going to have to say, please put in your proposals to LCA. Really want to see you there. This is my second time at pycon-au. I was at Hobart in 2013, so it's really great to be coming back here. And the talk I'm giving is something that really comes from those two places that I live in. As both a developer and as a certified sex educator, I see the world from a certain perspective that is relatively unique. And when I say relatively, I'd say you'd be surprised how many developers are also sex educators. There's quite a few of us. But we have a special lens on the world, and that's what this talk is really going to be dealing with a little bit. It's a toolkit for empathetic coding. We're going to be delving into specific examples of uncritical programming and painful results from doing things in ways that were benignly intended. And doing that includes stepping back a little to look at the ways that we can carelessly push buttons or fail to make it easy for people to opt out of things, which is why this particular talk is going to start with a content warning. This talk addresses problems in how developers deal with sensitive topics. That section is going to begin in about 5 or 6 minutes in, and it's going to include some particular issues, including grieving, PTSD, depression, miscarriage, infertility, surveillance, racial profiling, sexual history, consent, and assault. So like I said, there's 5-10 minutes until we get to that, so if it's something you want to think about, you've got a little bit of time. Algorithms are imposing consequences on people all the time. We're able to extract these remarkably precise insights about an individual, but do we really have a right to know what they didn't consent to share with us, even when they willingly consent to share something else that leads us there? How are we going to mitigate against unintended consequences of this? We start by looking at what is an algorithm itself. We have some preconceived ideas, but in its most basic form, it's a step-by-step set of instructions for operations for predictably arriving at a certain outcome. And predictably is key here. So we think about algorithms usually in terms of computer science and mathematics, patterns of instructions that are articulated in code or in formulas, but there are other kinds of algorithms in the world all the time around us. And those are just patterns of instructions articulated in all sorts of interesting ways. They could be map instructions, recipes, crochet patterns. If you think your code is obscure, try reading that for a while. All right, so algorithms, we have a certain new emergent technology lately called deep learning. It's really the new hotness right now in machine learning. It's technically not new at all. It's actually been around for decades, but it's really been locked in academia due to problems of scaling. But we've really now been able to take it from theory into real production practice with serious data sets. So let's talk about what that is. Oversimplified, you can think of deep learning simply as a technology for algorithms that are fast, trainable, artificial neural networks. So they're using ANNs to make fast, trainable algorithms. It's a particular approach to building and training artificial neural networks. You can think of these as decision-making black boxes. So you have input, and it's just an array of numbers representing words, concepts, or objects. We're not talking about binary here. We're talking about just assigning some sort of numerical values to give some sort of meaning. And in execution, you're just running a series of functions against the array, and outputs are predictors of properties that will be useful for drawing future intuitions about similar data. And similar is really important here. Those intuitions only work if the data that you train it with truly is similar enough to the data that you then later try to intuit from. So deep learning relies on that automated discovery of patterns within the training data set, and then it applies those discoveries to draw intuitions. So let's look at a very practical example of what I mean by that. MAR-IO. It's an example of an artificial neural network. It, and I'm just going to quote the author, kicks butt at Super Mario World. Here's what's important about MAR-IO. It teaches itself how to play Super Mario World. It starts with no clue at all. It's just manipulating numbers and taking note of what happens. So it's learning basic patterns of movement and play via a training session in which it engages in 24 hours of experimentation, iterating over and over again. That leads it to identify patterns that give it insights into how to use its world. Deep learning depends on artificial neural nets, and those in turn depend on the data that they've been trained on. Every flaw, every assumption in the training data set is going to have unacknowledged influence on algorithms and the outcomes that they generate. That part is the important thing to remember as we look at some examples up ahead. Okay, I ask a question. Would you like to play a game of data mining fail? Yes. Oh, good Australians, thank God. It's Sunday morning. You could have said no. All right, so we're going to try to do this as a game of bingo. I warn you right now, it's the strangest game of bingo you ever played. There are just too many problems to deal with. It's really beyond bingo and trying not to fill the entire board with all the possible failures you can make. There's so many pitfalls, but we can look at some examples and appreciate how many of the pitfalls exist and why they present new challenges for us to consider, for us to deal with. So here's that bingo board, and let's play a couple of rounds using some case studies. Target. Target stores exist here, and they're relatively similar to the ones that I'm talking about, but they're actually two separate chains with different owners. But in principle, it's the same kind of idea of a massive chain of stores that sells a lot of different things, everything from clothing to groceries to housewares and tools. So they've got this wide range of products. And the thing about a store like this is that they need you to buy all of it, right? So retailers are always looking for the loyal customer. And Target in particular was interested in a certain period because there are only a few moments in life, as it turns out, when people change radically their ways of buying things, their habits for where they go, what they buy, what brands they choose. And one of those is when they have a child. And it's not even just, I'm having a child, it's at a particular time, around the second trimester, that people start radically changing those habits. And everything that they've spent a lifetime building up as spending habits is suddenly up for grabs. And so if a merchandiser can get you at that moment to start buying from them and start seeing them as the source of all of your needs, then they've got you locked in for life, you and that child that's coming and your whole family. So for Target, trying to identify when is someone in their second trimester was a really interesting question. And they looked at their data and they actually were able to pin that down pretty darn well without anyone telling them anything about, any direct information that would lead to that. Just by using all of the cloud of information that they had, they were able to pin this down. All right, so they start sending out mailers. They sent out mailers with coupons for various things that one would get as you are approaching your second trimester. And they sent it out to the people that they had targeted very successfully. And that was working great until a guy came into a store and he started yelling at the store manager. How dare you send these coupons to my teenage daughter? Are you telling her to go get pregnant? What's wrong with you? Manager apologizes. A couple of days later, he feels like he should apologize again. He calls up the guy. The guy says, I'm so sorry. I talked to my daughter, and there have been some things going on in the house I didn't know about. My daughter is pregnant. Okay. So Target took a lesson from this. Their lesson was don't invade privacy, though. Their lesson wasn't let's tune the algorithm. The lesson they took is let's change the coupons so it's less obvious that we're targeting you specifically for pregnancy. So now you get the coupon, but there's a lawnmower coupon right next to it. So you won't know. I mean, hey, everyone's probably getting coupons for, diapers and lawnmowers. That's a nearly direct quote. So this is their great strategy, right? I want to call it a pitfall. Let's not do that. Let's deal with the actual source of the problem. One of those problems is disclosure and consent. All right, let's look at another one. Shutterfly. All sorts of fun problems in this case study. So they too were interested in, that period when people are starting a family. In this case, they sent out emails or coupons, I forget which was, saying basically, congratulations on your bundle of joy. Now that you're a parent, you need to send out thank you letters for the shower you had. A couple of problems. One, how do you know I had a shower? Okay. Two, thanks, Shutterfly, for the congratulations on my new bundle of joy. I'm horribly infertile, but hey, I'm adopting a cat, so. Yeah. I lost a baby in November who had been due this week. It was like hitting a wall all over again. Shutterfly responded to that essentially saying, oops, we had some false positives. Our intent was merely to target people who had recently had a baby. False positives, when we're starting to deal with human data, we have to start caring about them way more. They're no longer just an edge case. A false negative, a false positive can be deeply meaningful for the person that we're talking to. We have to be much more sure or much more careful in what we communicate. Mark Zuckerberg announced this week that he is going to become a father. And he wrote in his blog post about this, or Facebook post, that they had already had 3 miscarriages before this pregnancy. And he described that. You feel so hopeful when you learn you're going to have a child. You start imagining who they'll become, dreaming of hopes for their future. You start making plans, and then they're gone. It's a lonely experience. Most people won't discuss miscarriages because you worry your problems will distance you or reflect upon you as if you're defective or did something to cause this. So you struggle on your own. This Mark Zuckerberg is not the one that VCs are eagerly recruiting. The one 10 years ago who didn't know that half of all pregnancies will end in miscarriage, that 10 to 25% of known pregnancies will result in miscarriage. The Mark Zuckerberg who's experienced the pain of that, that's the guy who isn't interesting, right? We need people like this one to have the understanding of the world and some sort of compassion for how difficult life becomes a little while after you get out of college. So let's deal with Facebook. They did a study several years ago. They called it the Emotional Contagion Study. The idea here was to see if by manipulating your timeline, you could make someone a little bit happier or a little bit sadder. And the idea here was to select posts from your friends that had words that were positive or negative, and see if we just start filling your timeline with those, does your mood change? What they did not do was consider the difference between manipulating someone into feeling a little bit happier and, for instance, manipulating a depressed person into being a little bit sadder. These are the kinds of studies, if they're done in academia, require a considerable amount of review. They require informed, active consent from participants. Facebook didn't do those things. What they did do is use researchers from academia to give them kind of the imprimatur of ethical research and got it published in academic journal. But academics looked upon this research as incredibly not okay, that this isn't the way we do things, this is the way corporations do things, and we don't want to participate in research like this. So the standards for how to conduct ethical research on people are really only being applied in this one side of the industry, the side that's not professional practice. we need to be taking some of their knowledge about how to oversee study of people to make sure that we're doing that in ways that are not abusive of them. In this case, those people had absolutely no idea they were participating in a study, let alone were okay with it. And the end result of this is that even though it was the largest study ever conducted like this, it also had what is believed to be the tiniest detectable change ever. So they did all of that, and what was the result? Was it worth the trade-off? Did human knowledge advance in some significant way? Facebook Year in Review has been around for a while. In previous years, it was something more or less that you could curate. Last year, they decided to get more automated about it, being able to look at your timeline and algorithmically predict what posts of the past year were your most important moments in life, and to be able to present you with those. Inadvertent algorithmic cruelty is the result of code that works in the overwhelming majority of use cases, but doesn't take other use cases into account. That's Eric Meyer's definition, and the reason that he gets to coin it and name it is because he's the one that it happened to. His daughter died, and he had to be confronted with a Facebook post reminding him of her. This might have been the most important moment of his year, but it certainly wasn't the one that he wanted to commemorate. It certainly wasn't the one he wanted to be confronted with. All year long, we have things change. We have losses. Things that were, even back then, great, might not be the ones anymore that we're excited about. Algorithmically trying to predict based on things like how many page views and how many likes are not ever going to tell us how someone feels about that today. Eric's recommendation is that we need to increase awareness and consideration of the failure modes, the edge cases, the worst case scenarios. And so that's what I'm hoping that we can do here today and that you can carry with you. And one of the things that I think is really important in this is that we have to be humble. We have to acknowledge that we cannot intuit inner states. We cannot intuit private emotions, subjectivity, all the stuff that's going on in heads and hearts. We are not that smart. Not yet, anyway. That does bring us to issues of consent and de-anonymization. Fitbit, you're probably familiar with it. Tracker mostly used to track activities, walking, running, things like that. When it was first released, it had a sex tracker, giving you the opportunity to keep track of yet another physical activity, right? This is really great. This is really helpful. As a sex educator, I can only applaud paying close attention to a healthy, happy sex life. However, what Fitbit did not do is consider that some kinds of data we track are more private than others, which led to it being default public. Ooh, we're missing that slide. Oh my gosh. Okay, well, I'll have to just tell you. It was actually a control panel showing, how many hours of sex you've had this week. I realize that some people gamify everything. And from Fitbit's product perspective, what a great way to market it, right? Get people excited about, gamifying their whole life. But it was the lack of thought about the user experience of sharing everything from the user perspective that was really the problem here. From a product perspective, the more visible the product was, the more visible the data was, the better for a new product to get buzz, get launched, get visible. From a user perspective, this was really abusive. So here's how they solved this problem when it was finally exposed. Robots.txt, done. This kills me. They no longer, as I understand it, offer sex tracking. I guess they decided that that was a little too difficult to figure out, which I think is interesting because really the only identified problem here was how to handle data. as a concept, it was perfectly sound. And in fact, there are a lot of other products that have tried to fill that space as well in various ways. So, there is a need, but they didn't deal with it in the beginning. They didn't think about it and care about it enough, and they still haven't decided that they want to address it. How do you tackle this? So they've passed over the opportunity altogether, and that's sad. Uber. All right, there's so many things that you could say about Uber, so I only get 45 minutes. I'm going to focus on God View. All right, so God View is a control panel. We all have things that we need to monitor, performance, stats, activity, uptime, whatever it is, we've all got stuff that needs to be continuously monitored. God View is simply their monitoring control panel. It's high level, and it tracks the cars. It tracks individual customers in the cars. It tracks individual customers' locations when they're not in the cars. In fact, it was revealed last week that it tracks individual customers always. If you have Uber on your phone right now, OddView is aware of that. So what was the problem? I mean, that's just ordinary stuff that we do. The problem is that they used it for entertainment value. It wasn't being used for business purposes. It was being used in wining and dining investors in order to impress them with how well they could stalk people. Got a friend who's coming, someone's late to the party. Hey, this will be fun, let's see where they are. And then they discovered that they can also do really excellent things, like a reporter one day was running late to a meeting, so an executive used GodView to track her down. For some reason, knowing that she had a phone that he was tracking her on, he did not call or text her. He used this great God power instead. These are the kinds of abuses of the extent of our vast access to data that are a problem. It's not the algorithm, it's the assumptions of the users of the algorithm. We need to be really careful in how we use these precious data. They also used it, they had to release some data publicly. There's Freedom of Information Act, which I understand you have similar things here in the US. It is simply a law that allows for government-generated data to be accessible to the public by request. So in this case, Uber's data was released. They had supposedly anonymized it. The anonymization was insufficient, resulting in the ability to actually trace back those anonymized records to real people, in this case including celebrities, and the ability to find out exactly where they were staying. This too presents a little bit of a problem, especially when you start thinking about other people and other reasons why someone might be stalked. Other reasons why someone who has need to use a private vehicle to get around might not want the ability to have in real time their supposedly identification number 1277 be identified directly back to them by anyone. Okay. And then there was this one. So the walk of shame is the idea that you have casual sex and come home late at night in the same clothes you had on yesterday. Uber decided that they can algorithmically determine which of their riders is doing the walk of shame. Okay, so that sounds kind of funny, right? Like we can really learn interesting, we can mine our data and find interesting, fun things to learn about our customers. Difficulty here is that this is incredibly unrelated to the primary mission of the company. When OkCupid does a blog post about funny things they learn about dating from their data, that's one thing. No one expects Uber to be using their data to judge their personal life. It's a really different scenario, and they treat it as if they're kind of interchangeable. This is a problem of a lot of the companies that are doing this, is they see consent as something that's simply permission granted, and they treat it as if there's a whole bunch of fine print that really can just be tossed into terms of service and that, all done with it. The reality of consent is used by professional researchers and sex educators, a different standard altogether called informed consent. And in this, informed consent is something freely granted, where no is consequence-free alternative, and no is the default value, and it's given with informed appreciation and understanding ahead of time of the facts involved. And when you look at that definition, not just permission granted, the apps that we make, the apps that we use, have we ever gotten or given informed consent to do the kinds of things that we're looking at here? We're really not. Informed consent doesn't have to necessarily be hard. It can be something simply when asking a question of saying, in Facebook's case, would you be interested in participating in a research study? Check. We would like to learn more about depression and Facebook posts. Check. These don't necessarily have to be so deeply involved that people stop reading. And as soon as we create it in such a way that people are going to stop reading, we're really evading the whole point. Google AdWords, a Harvard research study, looked at names that are highly correlated with Black people and highly correlated with white people, and did some Google AdWords searches with them, just looking for the person's name. And what they did was they determined what names fit these categories and then matched them with real people who are academics. So people who had real professional qualifications working in their field. And by searching on their names, they found something really interesting. Women who were Black were significantly more likely to return an ad suggesting that they had an arrest record. Why? Were the advertisers doing this? Were there records that were different? No. The problem is the whole notion of how Google calculates PageRank. Think about what it is. It considers relevance on the basis of things like clicks, how often people click here. The racial biases of the vast community of users of Google subtly biases this algorithm. So the fact that people are more likely to click when they see a Black person's name associated with arrest means that over time, that ad starts to be more favorably chosen among all the possibilities. It had a bunch of possibilities, all the same ads, confirmed by the advertisers themselves, identical ads with Google slowly learning that what you really should do is put at the top for Black women the ones that suggest that they have been arrested. Black identifying name was 20% more likely to result in that arrest record ad. Image analysis is another really popular application for deep learning. There's various things you can do. You can do image confirmation, essentially confirming that this image is that image, or that the subject of this image is the subject of that image, even if the pictures themselves are not identical. You can do image analysis. You can do image recognition, for instance, looking at a picture and saying, oh, that's a cat. All these things are ways that machine learning can be applied. One example, for instance, is iPhoto face detection. It's really good. This is a couple of years ago, so cut them some slack. They've gotten better. But we have been seeing facial recognition technology cropping up in consumer technology for a few years now, and this is, just one of those examples. You probably have it in your camera as well. And of course, we do see the funny mistakes. Detecting a face in your cookie. And that's a pretty harmless mistake. And so it's easy to chuckle at because it's so harmless. Facial recognition technology has been merging, though, with pattern matching, and that's where we're seeing things that matter much more. This is Flickr. They introduced auto-tagging recently, and this is just 2 months ago. This is Auschwitz. Concentration camp that it automatically tagged as sports and jungle gym. in some sort of way, it got pattern matching right. I mean, there's something here. You can see where it might have reached those conclusions. The problem is that pattern matching and image recognition are not the same thing as comprehension. And in this case, comprehension matters far more. Also auto-tagged. The one that's missing is where he was also auto-tagged as ape. Why would this happen? This was 2 months ago. Here's 1 month ago. Google Photos doing almost the same thing. Why are black people being auto-tagged as animals? For this, you actually have to go back in history quite a while. In the 1950s, when film stocks were really being refined, this was George Eastman, United States, 1950s, a time when the US was still incredibly racially segregated, and black people were their own economic market of not particular importance. And so film stocks were optimizing for getting maximum details out of white values, out of fair skin, out of white cloth, all of this. So historically, we have a huge corpus of images of black people with very low detail. And so even though these algorithms are being trained by vast data sets that are considered very high quality, the vast data set is always biased in terms of quality of pictures of white people versus black people. The amount of useful data that can be drawn from those images is very different, and the ability to make mistakes will thus always be very different. This isn't easy to change. Digital has started to shift in the video realm. They've started to make new advancements that make it much more possible to capture a full range of detail across the spectrum. Still images, even in digital today, are really not showing that same kind of innovation. So these problems are reproduced over and over again. And as we have more and more mobile phones, think about how poor your mobile phone's image sensor is compared to film. These problems will continue. So we're going to have to ask ourselves questions about what to do about it. And finally, here is a firm. It is a credit lending service. The idea here is to evaluate creditworthiness. The way they do this is with machine learning. And their innovation is to make it super duper easy. So when you apply, you only have to give, I think, 4 things. Mobile phone number, name, let's see, we've got the birthday, and last 4 digits of your national ID number. Okay. And based on that, they go and they comb the web and they find all sorts of things. They say that they have 70,000 attributes that the algorithm looks at. And that sounds like a really complete way to look at people, right? Not just a few simple things about their spending patterns, but really looking at them as a whole person. The problem is that the things that you choose come with biases. 2% of open source contributors are women. So when you choose to use GitHub profile as a way of evaluating creditworthiness, you immediately are changing who is able to get evaluated by this and how fair that evaluation will be. Look at some of the other ways that they're evaluating. Which of your social networks is useful information? I'm told that Facebook and Twitter do not indicate good creditworthiness, but LinkedIn does. Okay, why would that be? Why? If you think about it, white-collar professionals are much more likely to use LinkedIn than blue-collar workers, right? It's built for that. So people who are much more likely to have a stable income in the first place. Are you evaluating how good their character is at paying debt, or are you simply evaluating that they are middle class or more? What are you actually getting? Okay, so you're getting a lot of false negatives, people who are rejected for reasons that have nothing to do with their ability to pay and have everything to do with replicating privilege. Replication, remember, that's an algorithm. All right, so the founder's idea here is that this is great because we do have 70,000 qualities. I mean, sure, one or two might be biased, but who's going to know, who's going to care? And good thing here is that humans aren't biasing it. Whew! We sure wouldn't want any humans messing with it. This is a crazy idea. Data is not objective. It's never objective. It always has bias inherent at minimum with how it was collected and interpreted. How many of those 70,000 factors are accidentally leading to discriminatory outcomes? How would any of us know? How would the person affected possibly know? And what recourse would they possibly have, even if they could pin that down? Rationales for the algorithm can only be seen from inside of a black box. So I took a picture for you of the inside of a really, really black box. The thing about lending decisions inside of a black box is it's not disrupting the lending industry, it's disrupting the regulation of the lending industry. And this worries me because right now US government regulators are in fact looking specifically at Affirm and other companies that are using these models, and they're excited. They want to know how they can use this too. Other large financial institutions are watching closely. They're excited. The thing here is that we're not innovating on technology, we're innovating on getting rid of regulation that protects people from predatory lending. We need to be very cautious in what we do with this. Is black box really how we should be shunting off those decisions? So we can do some things about this by taking lessons from the professional ethicists. This is a specialized field in itself. I've adapted a few ideas from the Association for Computing Machinery's Code of Ethics, as well as a few other sources. First, avoid harm to others. Second, consider the decision's impacts and potential impacts on others. I say others specifically because this isn't about us. We're always going to make, evaluating the company part of the decision-making process. We need to be conscious about making sure others are also in the decision-making process. Project the likelihood of consequences to others. We need to be thinking about how to contribute to human well-being by minimizing negative consequences to others. All right, we've anticipated possibilities. Now what can we do to minimize? We need to be incredibly honest and trustworthy because guaranteed we will continue to make mistakes like these and others we have not anticipated at all. None of these were things that were easily predictable. So count on the fact that we're going to screw up, and the important thing is we need to know that we've built enough trust to survive it. We need to provide others with full disclosure of limitations. We need to call attention to signs of risk of harm to others. We need to actively counter bias and inequality, doing that at levels of equality, tolerance, respect, justice, anti-discrimination. These are things that are systemic, they're cultural, they're in our assumptions, our ignorance, and sometimes even in malice. But they're all over. There's unequal access to resources and power, unfair outcomes. Our algorithms are participating in that. So what can we do? We can audit outcomes. Even though we can't see what's going on inside of the black box, what we can do is look in from the reverse. These are essentially design patterns that are well used in auditing for things like discrimination in housing and in employment. So for instance, you would have two people who should be exactly equally qualified, put in an identical resume simply with different names, for instance, the black-sounding name and the white-sounding name, and see if they do get the same result. If the algorithm treats them as identical, great. Then we can say on that particular metric, the system does seem to be working correctly. If we do those audits and we find that some of those are being treated unequally, that's where things get harder. Because then what do you do about it? How do you tune for that? That's a whole problem in itself. Right now, we're in a race. We're in an arms race. In the past year, there have been a tremendous number of acquisitions of deep learning companies by Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft. They're all jumping into this right now. And so now is the time when we need to be actively thinking about what is this future going to be? We're writing this code. How are we writing it for human users? And how are we writing it for the consequences that are built in for them? For the moment, the quality of these things does vary, but the point is that they're training, they're learning, they're refining. Things will move very quickly. And that's a dilemma that we have to take seriously as developers. Our algorithms are suddenly growing massively more intuitive. That's exciting, but it does have a lot of potential for problems. And that's why we have to identify potential harms. We have to insist on getting this stuff right because we want to be empathetic coders. We see the potential, but often what we see is too abstract to guide us in doing something about it. We need to be better at identifying problematic scenarios. And for that, we have to be able to anticipate diverse ways to screw up. We cannot do that without highly diverse teams. And I mean the real kind, genuinely, deeply diverse in as many facets as possible. Whenever the teams charged with defining data collection, data use, analysis are less diverse than the user base itself, we're going to keep on failing. Think about that team at Flickr and at Google Photos. How many black engineers did they have? Those problems are incredibly well known to black people. They're used to their photos always sucking. Okay? This is something that a diverse team would have been more resilient on. We have to have decision-making authority in the hands of genuinely diverse teams. They have to be diverse in kind, form, and character. That is the definition of diversity. Diversity is not tokenism. It's not culture fit. The whole point of culture fit is to avoid disruption of groupthink. Unidimensional variety is not diversity either. It's superficial. The point is we need to have people of very different experiences, really different perspectives, people who have completely different ideas about how the world works. This is diversity. It's wildly varied on as many dimensions as possible. Differing origins, differing ages, differing assumptions, differing experiences, differing ideas on how to solve the same basic problem. We need to cultivate informed consent. And by that I mean enthusiastically informed consent. Not just saying, oh, fine, whatever, I agree. But saying, yeah, I want that feature. Give me that. Where do I sign up for that? That is informed, excited consent. That's the kind of consent we should be cultivating and excited about. We have to be doing that auditing constantly. There will always be things that we can't see on our own. We need to recognize that the bias is inherent. It's always inheriting the bias conditions that it arose from. And so we're going to have to be visionary about countering bias in the data, in the analyses, in the impacts. And finally, we have to aim mining tools themselves at public benefit consequences. All these things that we have are aimed right now so much at the private sector. What are the possibilities when we take that much data and be able to ask questions about, say, public health? And finally, we have to commit to transparency. That means that both data transparency and algorithmic transparency need to be part of that conversation. And that is truly the hard one, right? That's the one where companies are always pulling back and saying, you know, the data is proprietary, the algorithm, that's the core IP. What are you talking about? We can't possibly make that public. You know, they consider these things trade secrets. And all I can say to that is, I remember a time not very long ago at all when we had to fight for open source in our tool bag. That they made a lot of those same arguments of, we can't, this will ruin the company, you don't understand. We pushed back, and we were right to push back. And we have those tools available for us today, and our profession is better off for it. We are the professionals. We know that transparency is crucial for drawing insights that are real. So we need to be the ones to argue for increasing transparency because it's for the sake of a better product, because it's for cleaner features, because there's going to be fewer bugs, because our tests will be more resilient, because the users are going to be happier and more trusting, and we'll have the public's trust as well. These are reasons to insist. We are hired for more than just writing code. We're hired as professionals who use our expertise and our judgment about how to solve problems. Problem solving is our core feature. Our role is to be opinionated about how to make code serve a problem space well. So do that here. When we're asked to write code that presumes to intuit people's internal life, and to act on assumptions about that, we have to be their proxies, we have to be their advocates, saying no on their behalf to using their data in ways that they have not enthusiastically and knowingly consented to. Say no to uncritically reproducing systems that were biased to begin with. Saying no to writing code that imposes unauthorized consequences on their lives. In short, we need to refuse to play along. Thank you.